My name is Hale Blackburn. 48 hours ago, I was an offshore oil rig safety specialist. Now I might be one of the last survivors in Bellingham. The dead are walking, the mainland is compromised, and everything I know about disaster prevention is being tested. This is how I survived the first 48 hours of the zombie outbreak. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. If you're watching this, you already know what happened. What you don't know is how some of us made it through those first critical hours. My name is Hale Blackburn, and until 2 days ago, I was just another offshore oil rig safety specialist working out of the Bellingham office. Now I might be one of the few survivors from the mainland. I want to tell you how I survived, not just to share my story, but because what I learned might keep you alive too. Safety protocols exist for a reason. In my line of work, they're the difference between everyone going home or bodies being recovered from the sea. Turns out, the same principles that keep people alive during oil rig disasters work pretty well during the apocalypse too. The day before it all happened, October 11th, was completely ordinary. Well, almost ordinary. Looking back, there were signs. Small things that didn't register as important at the time. That morning, we got some unusual maintenance reports from platform Echo 7. Nothing critical, just some communication glitches with the coastal facilities. The kind of thing that happens during storm season, except the weather was clear. In hindsight, the signs were there. The same way pressure gauges start to flutter before a blowout. But who connects technical glitches to the end of the world? No one does. That's why most people didn't make it. I arrived at the offshore safety office at 7:30 the next morning, October 12th. The sun was just coming up over the bay, and I remember thinking it was going to be a beautiful day. I stopped for coffee at the shop downstairs like I always did. Marla, the barista, mentioned her brother in Seattle had called about some kind of raid the night before. Said the police had cordoned off whole neighborhoods. I didn't think much of it. By 8:15, I was at my desk reviewing evacuation protocols for the Echo 7 platform when our office manager announced the quarterly safety drill was canceled. No explanation, just canceled. That was the first real sign something was wrong. In 5 years, we never canceled a drill. Around 9, one of our radio monitors picked up unusual chatter. Coast Guard vessels redirecting from regular patrols to the harbor area. Police bands buzzing with codes I didn't recognize. And then news reports mentioning isolated incidents in Bellingham and other coastal cities. Most of my coworkers dismissed it. Jenkins from accounting actually laughed it off. Remember that gas leak panic last year? Same thing. He kept saying that right up until the end. By 10:30, I started hearing sirens in the distance. Not just one or two, but dozens all over the city. I tried calling my grandmother over in Sahome Hill. No answer. Then my cousin in Fairhaven. Nothing. The cell networks were getting overloaded. Internet was becoming spotty too. People around the office were starting to worry about family members. Some left early to pick up kids from school. Others were glued to news sites, refreshing constantly as reports came in about disturbances downtown. On a rig, we're trained to recognize cascade failures, when one system failing triggers others. That morning, I was watching society's systems fail one by one. Communications first, then emergency services, transportation next. Around 11, our office manager came back from a meeting downtown. Her face was pale. She told us there had been attacks at the hospital and the shopping center. Actual attacks, people biting other people. She said the police were overwhelmed. The National Guard had been called. We kept working, but the mood had changed. Everyone was distracted, worried. I quietly started gathering emergency supplies from the office safety cabinet. Flashlights, first aid kit, emergency radio. Nobody noticed. They were all too busy trying to reach loved ones or watching the increasingly alarming news reports. In emergency response, we have a saying. The absence of information is information. The silence from official channels told me everything I needed to know. No press conferences. No emergency broadcasts with specific instructions. Just vague warnings to stay indoors and avoid contact with agitated individuals. At 1:15, the power flickered. Just for a second, but in that moment, the office went completely silent. Everyone looked up from their screens. We all felt it. Something fundamental had changed. By 2:30, most of the office had emptied out. Only about 10 of us remained, either because we couldn't reach family or because we thought the office might be safer than trying to navigate whatever was happening outside. That's when Melissa from HR stumbled in. Her blouse was soaked with blood. There was a wound on her neck, clearly a bite mark. Human teeth had torn through skin and muscle. She collapsed at the doorway, gasping for help. We gathered around her, trying to help. Henderson called for an ambulance, but the emergency line was just a recorded message about high call volumes. Rivera from operations tried to stop the bleeding with paper towels. Chen from engineering checked her vitals. I stood back, watching her eyes. They were glassy, unfocused. Nobody knew what to say. Henderson started making calls for an ambulance, but I knew it was too late. What I didn't know was that it was also too early. She died 20 minutes later, right there on the office floor. The bite wound had done too much damage. We covered her with someone's jacket and backed away, stunned by how quickly everything had happened. Looking at her body, I remembered a platform worker I'd seen after witnessing his friend fall to his death. That 1,000-yard stare that says, everything just changed. We all had that look now. The silence in the room was absolute. Someone suggested calling the police to report the death. Someone else mentioned moving the body somewhere more dignified than the office floor. But before we could decide anything, Melissa moved. At first, it was just her fingers twitching. We thought it was some kind of postmortem reflex. Then her chest began to rise and fall again, but in a shallow, unnatural rhythm. When she opened her eyes again, they weren't Melissa's anymore. The irises were clouded over, milky white. There was nothing behind them. No recognition. No humanity. Jenkins approached her, confused and relieved. "Melissa, are you okay?" "We thought you were." He never finished the sentence. You never forget the sound. Not the screaming, the feeding. That wet, tearing sound as the thing that used to be Melissa, tore into Jenkins' throat. The spray of blood across the office windows. The way his legs kept kicking even after his screams stopped. The office erupted into chaos. People ran in all directions. Some froze in place, unable to process what they were seeing. The thing that had been Melissa looked up from Jenkins' body, blood dripping from her mouth, and turned toward the rest of us. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and discharged it directly into her face. The foam blinded her temporarily, giving me enough time to shout for the others to follow me. Only 4 responded. Henderson from communications, Rivera from operations, Chen from engineering, and Larson from administration. The rest either ran in different directions or were too shocked to move. In rig evacuations, panic kills more than fire. I fell back on training. Everyone stop. Breathe. We have exactly 90 seconds to make a plan. We barricaded the office door using a desk and filing cabinets. Through the glass partition, we could see Melissa, or what remained of her, tearing chunks from Jenkins' body. Others from the office were now screaming from down the hall. More of them were turning. We did a quick inventory. Between us, we had my emergency supplies, a few personal items, and whatever office tools might serve as weapons. Not much against whatever was happening out there. I pulled up the building's emergency exit map on my phone before the signal disappeared completely. There was a maintenance exit 3 floors down that led directly to the parking lot. From there, we could try to reach vehicles or find better shelter. I'd spent 5 years mapping evacuation routes for worst-case scenarios on oil platforms. Never thought I'd use those skills to escape my own office building. But the principles were the same. Identify exit routes, move calmly, stay together. We moved through the hallways as quietly as possible. The building's emergency lights had activated, filling the corridors with an eerie red glow. We encountered 3 more of the infected on the stairs. They moved sluggishly, but with purpose, drawn to the sound of our footsteps. Chen swung a fire axe he'd grabbed from the emergency cabinet, catching one in the shoulder. It didn't even flinch, just kept coming. Henderson panicked and pushed past us, drawing the attention of the infected. We lost sight of Larson in the confusion. We made it to the ground floor and found the maintenance exit. Outside, the parking lot was beginning to fill with more of the infected. They wandered aimlessly until any noise drew their attention. About 50 yards from the building was a maintenance shed near the docks. It looked secure with its metal door and small windows. I pointed to it and we ran, trying to stay low and quiet. By some miracle, we made it inside and secured the door behind us. The shed was stocked with maintenance equipment, tools, spare parts, cleaning, supplies. We blocked the windows with shelving units and took stock of our situation. For the first time since Melissa attacked, we had a moment to process what was happening. Henderson kept checking his phone, trying to get a signal. Rivera sat in the corner, shaking. Chen examined the wound he'd received on his arm during our escape. A deep cut from broken glass, not a bite thankfully. I tried the emergency radio I'd grabbed from the office. Most channels were static, but we caught fragments of emergency broadcasts. Reports of similar attacks across the region. Words like infection and quarantine and evacuation centers. Henderson kept saying help would come. 20 years in emergency response told me different. When systems cascade like this, help isn't coming. We were on our own, just like being on a rig in the middle of a storm. Through the small window of the shed, we watched Bellingham deteriorate over the next few hours. By sunset, I counted 8 separate fires in the downtown area alone. No sirens anymore? No helicopters, just silence and smoke. The infected grew in numbers as darkness fell. They congregated in groups, dozens then hundreds, moving through the streets like a grotesque tide. We took shifts watching and resting, though I doubt any of us truly slept. In the dark, we learned our first survival lesson. They hunt by sound but seem drawn to light too. River almost got us killed when she tried to use her phone flashlight to search for supplies. The movement and light drew 3 infected to our window. We froze in silence for nearly an hour until they wandered away. We developed a system of whispered communication and kept movement to a minimum. The night stretched endlessly as we listened to distant screams that gradually became fewer and farther between. By the time the sun rose on October 13th, the world as we knew it had ended. Looking through the window at first light, I could see that Bellingham had transformed overnight. The streets were filled with wandering infected. Smoke rose from at least a dozen buildings. Cars were abandoned in the middle of roads, some still with doors open where people had flowed. When the sun came up, I counted at least 40 of them just in the parking lot. The city I'd known my entire life was gone in less than 24 hours. That's when we heard the final Coast Guard transmission on the emergency radio. All vessels remain at sea. Mainland compromised. Repeat, mainland compromised. With the Coast Guard's final message, we knew rescue wasn't coming. That's when I first thought about Platform Echo 7. It had been on my mind since the beginning, floating there in the South Sea, isolated and secure. A modern drilling platform is designed to support 50 people for months without resupply. Food, water, medical supplies, even defense capabilities. If we could reach it, we might actually survive this thing. I shared the idea with the others. Chen immediately understood the logic. He'd done contract work on the platforms and knew their capabilities. Henderson was skeptical, but desperate enough to consider anything. River just stared blankly out the window, still processing the collapse of everything around us. The supply vessel should still be docked at the marina, I told them. It makes weekly runs to the platforms. If we can reach it, we can make it to Echo 7. That's almost half a mile from here, Chen pointed out. Through all of them. He gestured toward the infected wandering outside. He was right. The distance wasn't great. But with the number of infected between us and the marina, it might as well have been 100 miles. We needed supplies, better weapons, and a solid plan before we could even attempt it. First things first, I said. We need more supplies if we're going to make it to the docks. There was a supply building about 100 yards from our shed. It contained maintenance equipment for the port facilities, and might have better tools, food from employee break rooms, maybe even communication equipment. We needed to reach it before attempting the longer run to the docks. I suggested using diversionary tactics, something I'd learned from rig fire drills. Create noise in one location to draw the infected away, then move quickly through the cleared area. Chen volunteered immediately. Henderson hesitated, then agreed to go too. River wasn't in any condition to help, so she stayed behind with me to prepare the shed for their return. We found some maintenance coveralls and had Chen and Henderson put them on for basic protection. Armed with a pipe wrench and screwdriver respectively, they left through the back door of the shed while I created a distraction by throwing a tool against a dumpster 30 yards in the opposite direction. The waiting was excruciating. Rivera barely spoke. She sat with her back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. I checked and rechecked the barricades we'd built, inventoried our meager supplies, and kept watch through the window. An hour passed. Then another. The sun climbed higher, and the heat in the small shed became oppressive. Just as I was considering going after them, we heard a scream in the distance. Henderson's voice, no mistake. Minutes later, Chen stumbled through the door, bleeding and gasping. They're everywhere, he wheezed. Henderson tried to hotwire a truck. The alarm went off. He didn't need to finish. Chen had managed to grab a backpack from the supply building. Inside was a first aid kit, some packaged food, 2 bottles of water, a crowbar, and a flashlight. Not much for what it had cost. I was treating the cut on Chen's arm when we heard them. The infected drawn to our location by Chen's return. They began pounding on the walls of the shed. Our barricades at the windows started to splinter. I grabbed tools from the workbench and handed Rivera a hammer. If they get in, aim for the head, I told her. Chen took a position by the door with the crowbar, his face pale from blood loss and exertion. The wood around one window frame started to give way. An arm pushed through, gray and mottled, fingers grasping blindly. River just stood there, hammer dangling from her hand, as the wood splintered. I'd seen that look before on rookie rig workers during their first blowout drill. The vine simply shuts down. I pushed past her and drove a screwdriver through the exposed arm. The infected didn't make a sound, just kept pushing forward. I stabbed again and again until the arm withdrew, then quickly reinforced the barricade with a metal shelf. We held them off for nearly 20 minutes before they finally began to lose interest. The infected seemed to have limited attention spans when no new noises attracted them. They wandered away one by one until the shed was surrounded by only 3 or 4 stragglers. Chen's condition was worsening. The cut on his arm wasn't deep, but it was showing signs of infection the regular kind. We cleaned it as best we could with supplies from the first aid kit, but he needed antibiotics we didn't have. As we ate some of the packaged food Chen had retrieved, we discussed our options. River wanted to wait for rescue. Someone will come, she insisted. The National Guard, the military someone. You heard the Coast Guard, Chen replied, wincing as he adjusted the bandage on his arm. The mainland is compromised. They're not coming. I shared everything I knew about Platform Echo 7. How it was designed to be self-sufficient. How it had its own water purification system, medical bay, even a small security arsenal for piracy threats. The regular crew should still be there, I explained. They work month-long rotations. They might not even know what's happening on shore. River had kept saying we should wait it out. But I've investigated enough rig accidents to know. Indecision is a decision, and usually the wrong one. If we stay here, we die, I said simply. We're running out of food and water. Chen needs medical attention, and these barricades won't hold if a larger group of infected comes along. Chen supported my platform plan despite his injury. If we're going, it has to be tomorrow at dawn, he said. I'll be 2 weeks after that. That settled it. We would make our attempt the next morning. The rest of the day was spent preparing. I sketched a rough map of the route from our position to the marina where the supply vessel was docked. We identified potential choke points and danger areas. For maintenance supplies, we created improvised protective gear. We wrapped our forearms in duct tape and electrical tape. Not much, but enough to prevent a glancing bite. On rigs, we call it improvised PPE, personal protective equipment. Never thought I'd use it against the dead. I also adapted some rig fire suppression tactics for our situation. On platforms, we use smoke to test wind direction during fires. The infected seem to rely primarily on sound to find prey, but they might also use sight. Smoke could limit their visual tracking while we moved. We crafted diversionary devices from the shed supplies. Alarm clocks attached to metal buckets. When it went off, they'd create noise to draw the infected away from our path. By sunset, we had a plan. We'd set the diversions at strategic points, creating a corridor to the docks. We'd move at dawn when the infected seemed slightly less active. Once at the vessel, I knew the basic startup procedures for my safety training. If we could get it running, we'd be on our way to Echo 7 within minutes. That night was tense. We took turns keeping watch, though I doubt any of us slept much. The weight of what we were about to attempt hung heavy in the small space. Around midnight, I caught Rivera trying to sneak out. I need to find my sister, she whispered when I confronted her. She works at the hospital. I can't leave without knowing. I talked her down, explaining that her sister would want her to survive, that reaching the platform might be our only chance to help others later. She finally relented, but I could see the guilt eating at her. Chen tried to hide it, but infection was setting in the normal kind, not whatever was turning people. His arm was hot to touch, the makeshift bandage soaked through. On morning, he was feverish, but insisted he could make the journey. Dawn broke on October 14th, the second day of the outbreak. The atmosphere in the shed was one of grim determination. We ate the last of our food and divided the remaining water. Chen took some painkillers from the first aid kit, though they barely took the edge off his fever. River had been quiet all morning, her earlier panic replaced by a hollow resignation. She meticulously wrapped tape around her wrists and ankles as I'd shown her, but her movements were mechanical, detached. I did a final equipment check. The backpack contained our remaining supplies. The diversionary devices were ready. We each had a weapon of sorts, mine the crowbar, Chen a pipe wrench, Rivera a hammer. Not ideal against the infected, but better than nothing. Remember, I said as we prepared to leave, move quickly but quietly. If you need to take down an infected, aim for the head and don't hesitate. Stay close to me and follow the route we planned. In platform evacuations, timing is everything. Set off the alarms too early, people panic. Too late, they're trapped. The same principle applied here, but with higher stakes. We positioned our first noisemaker about 20 yards from the shed, setting it to go off 5 minutes after we left. It would draw the nearby infected away from our initial path. The second would activate near the supply building, creating our corridor to the docks. At precisely 6:30 in the morning, we slipped out the back door of the shed. The air was cool and damp, typical for Bellingham in October. The familiar smell of the sea mixed with the new, terrible odor of smoke and death. We moved between cars, staying low. Practice drills always assume perfect conditions. Reality never cooperates. Our primary route was blocked by at least 30 of them, clustered around what used to be a tour bus. We backtracked and found an alternate path between storage containers. The first diversion went off right on schedule, a clattering cacophony that immediately drew the attention of nearby infected. They shambled toward the sound, clearing our path temporarily. Chen was struggling to keep up, his breath coming in short gasps. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool morning air. Rivera stayed close behind me, her eyes darting in all directions. We reached the halfway point between the shed and the marina when disaster struck. Chen collapsed, his legs simply giving out. His skin was burning hot, the infection racing through his system. The second diversion failed to activate. The infected that had been drawn away by the first noise were beginning to lose interest and wander back in our direction. Others from deeper in the port facility were moving toward us, attracted by Chen's fall. Rivera began to panic as she saw them approaching. "We're not going to make it," she whispered harshly. I looked at Chen, and he nodded weakly. He understood the situation perfectly. "I'm not making it either way, Hale," he said. "Fever's too high. Make this count." He handed me his wallet. "If you make it, find my sister in Seattle." Before I could argue, he added, "I can create a diversion. The emergency siren on the administrative building. It'll draw them all away from the docks." It was suicide, and we all knew it. But it was also our only chance. "I'll go with you," Rivera suddenly volunteered, surprising both of us. Chen shook his head. "No point in 3 people dying instead of 1. Get to the platform. Find help if it's still out there." I wanted to argue, to find another way, but there wasn't one. This was the hard reality of survival now. Sometimes the only choices are bad ones. We helped Chen to his feet. He was barely able to stand, but determination burned in his eyes. We worked out his route to the administrative building and the location of the emergency alarm panel. 30 seconds after you hear the alarm, run for the docks, he instructed. "Don't look back. Don't wait for me." I clasped his hand one last time. "Thank you," was all I could say. He nodded, then turned and staggered toward the administrative building, using the pipe wrench as a makeshift cane. Rivera and I retreated to cover behind a forklift, waiting for the signal. Minutes passed, each one stretching endlessly. The infected continued to gather, somehow sensing our presence despite our stillness. They were 20 yards away, then 15, then 10. Just as they were about to detect us, the emergency siren shattered the morning silence. It wailed across the port, drawing infected from every direction. They moved toward the sound with single-minded focus, clearing the path to the dock gates. "Now," I said to Rivera, and we broke from cover, sprinting across the exposed concrete toward the marina. The dock gates were about 300 yards away. We ran full tilt, not bothering with stealth anymore. Speed was all that mattered now. I could see the supply vessel moored at the far end of the dock, untouched and intact. I looked back once. River had frozen again, 30 yards behind me. The dead were closing in. There was nothing I could do except honor Chen's sacrifice by surviving. I reached the dock gates only to find them locked. A heavy chain and padlock secured the entrance, standard port security protocol. On any normal day, I'd have turned around and found security personnel to grant access. But this was far from a normal day. The infected that had been drawn away by Chen's alarm were beginning to lose interest. Some had already turned back in my direction. River was nowhere to be seen. I assumed the worst but couldn't dwell on it. Survival meant focusing on the immediate problem, the locked gate. The fence was 8 feet tall with barbed wire at the top. Not designed to be climbed, but I had no choice. I threw the backpack over first, then jumped to grab the top of the fence below the barbed wire. The metal dug into my palms as I hauled myself up. 20 years of safety drills, and I'd never once practiced scaling an 8-foot security fence with the dead on my heels. The irony wasn't lost on me as I felt my ankle twist on landing. Pain shot up my leg, but adrenaline kept me moving. I grabbed the backpack and limped toward the supply vessel, pushing through the pain with each step. Behind me, infected began to gather at the fence, pushing against it with mindless persistence. The gangway to the vessel seemed a mile long. Every step sent lightning through my ankle. Behind me, the infected moved with horrible purpose, not fast, but relentless. Some had begun to find ways around the fence, entering the dock area from adjacent sections. I reached the vessel just as the first infected made it to the dock. It was a dock worker, or had been once. Now it was just a shambling corpse in a safety vest, eyes milky and vacant. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the ignition key. 5 years ago, I'd insisted all safety personnel learn basic vessel operation. You never know, I'd told my skeptical boss. I never knew how right I was. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I didn't have time for proper cast-off procedures. I grabbed a utility knife from the cabin and slashed through the mooring lines as infected reached the gangway. The vessel drifted away from the dock, painfully slow at first, then picking up speed as I engaged the engine. The infected reached the edge of the dock, several falling into the water in their mindless pursuit. They didn't swim, they didn't struggle, they simply sank. As I guided the vessel into the bay, I finally had a moment to breathe, to fully comprehend what had happened, what I'd lost, what the world had lost. From the water, Bellingham looked almost peaceful if you ignored the columns of smoke and distant figures wandering the waterfront. Everything familiar was gone in less than 2 days. I checked myself for injuries beyond my throbbing ankle. No bites, thank goodness. Some scratches and bruises from the escape. Exhaustion like I'd never known. But I was alive. I set course for platform Echo 7, visible on the horizon as a steel island in the South Sea. The journey would take approximately 2 hours at cruising speed. I found the first aid kit on board and properly bandaged my ankle. Then raided the small galley for food and water. The radio on the vessel was working, but most channels were static. I tried hailing the platform on the standard frequency. Platform Echo 7, this is supply vessel Mariner 4. Do you copy? Over. Nothing for several long minutes. Then, crackling through the static, identify yourself and state your business. I'd never heard sweeter words. Hail Blackburn, Safety Division. I'm possibly the only survivor from the Bellingham office. There was a pause. What's your situation, Blackburn? We've lost contact with shore facilities. The mainland is overrun, I replied. Some kind of infection. The dead are walking. I'm requesting emergency pickup and sanctuary. Another pause, longer this time. I could imagine the disbelief on the other end. Finally, approach to the north platform leg. We'll lower the personnel basket. Come alone. The relief nearly overwhelmed me. For 48 hours, I've been running on pure survival instinct. Now, with safety in sight, the full weight of everything crashed down. My hands trembled on the wheel. I forced myself to focus on the platform growing larger as I approached. Platform Echo 7 was massive, a floating city of steel rising hundreds of feet above the water. 4 enormous legs anchored it to the seabed below, while the main deck housed living quarters, control rooms, and the drilling operations, brought the vessel alongside the north leg as instructed. Above me, figures moved on the deck. A mechanical whine announced the descent of the personnel basket, a steel cage used to transfer workers from vessels when seas were too rough for gangway transfers. The basket touched down on the deck of the supply vessel. I grabbed the backpack, took one last look at the burning skyline of Bellingham, and stepped inside. The cage jerked, then began its ascent up the side of the platform. As I rose, I saw the full extent of the platform's size and complexity. Safety features I'd only read about in manuals came into view. Fire suppression systems, emergency evacuation boats, self-contained water and power generation. Everything needed to survive. The personnel basket reached the main deck. 4 men in work uniforms stood waiting, 3 with makeshift weapons, the 4th with a medical kit. Their expressions were a mixture of caution and concern. He's injured, said the one with the medical kit, stepping forward while the others maintained their distance. It's just my ankle, not a bite, I quickly clarified. Twisted at jumping a fence, the tension eased slightly. The medic, whose name tag read PTRS on, helped me out of the basket. We'll need to check you thoroughly before you join the general population, he explained. Protocol. I nodded. I'd expect nothing less. They escorted me to the infirmary, where Peterson examined me carefully for any bite marks or signs of infection. Another man, introducing himself as Jackson, the offshore installation manager, asked for my account of what had happened on shore. I told them everything, from the first signs to my narrow escape. About Henderson, Rivera, and Chen's sacrifice. About the infected and what I'd learned of their behavior. By the time I finished, Jackson's face had gone pale. "We've had no contact with shore for 36 hours, he said. "Some of the crew have family in Bellingham and the surrounding areas. This will hit them hard." "How many people on the platform?" I asked. 43, he replied. "Standard crew is 50, but we had some onshore for training when communications went down." Peterson finished cleaning and properly wrapping my ankle. "It's a mild sprain," he diagnosed. "Stay off it as much as possible for a few days." Jackson helped me to my feet. "Let's get you settled. Then we need to talk about next steps. If what you're saying is true, we need to prepare." I was assigned a bunk in the general crew quarters. After a hot shower, the first in days, I was given a fresh set of platform coveralls. The simple comforts were overwhelming after what I'd been through. A small crowd had gathered in the mess hall by the time I arrived. Word of a survivor from shore had spread quickly. Faces turned to me, hungry for information, for news of loved ones. I didn't have the heart to tell them the full horror of what I'd witnessed. Not yet. Jackson called a general meeting that evening. All non-essential personnel gathered in the briefing room while essential systems operators listened via the internal communications system. "As some of you have heard, we have a survivor from Bellingham," Jackson began. "Hale Blackburn from the Safety Division. What he's telling us is difficult to believe, but we have no reason to doubt him." He nodded to me, and I stood up, leaning on a crutch Peterson had provided. Looking out at the faces of the platform crew, I felt the weight of responsibility. These people needed to understand what we were facing if they were to survive. 3 days ago, I was reviewing evacuation protocols in our Bellingham office, I began. "Now, as far as I know, I might be one of the few survivors from the mainland." I told them everything, without sugarcoating the reality but also without unnecessary graphic details. I explained what I'd learned about the infected, their attraction to sound, their apparent lack of higher brain function, the infection spread through bites, the rapid turning of victims after death. Some faces registered disbelief. Others showed fear. A few nodded grimly, as if confirming suspicions formed when communications failed. "We need to prepare," I concluded. "The mainland is compromised. We don't know how widespread this is, but we have to assume the worst." Jackson stepped forward again. "Based on Blackburn's information, we're implementing emergency protocols effective immediately. All unnecessary power consumption will be rationed. Water usage will be monitored. Food supplies inventoried. Communication attempts with other platforms and vessels will continue." A hand went up from the crowd. "What about our families?" asked a woman in an engineer's uniform. Jackson looked to me, but this was his crew. His responsibility. "We'll organize reconnaissance once we have a better understanding of the situation," he said. "But our priority has to be the safety of everyone on this platform." The meeting continued with specific assignments and protocols. Platform Echo 7 was shifting to survival mode. Security watches were established. Inventory teams formed. Communication specialists tasked with reaching other platforms and vessels. By the time the meeting concluded, it was past midnight. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chen's face as he volunteered for his suicide mission. Rivera frozen in terror. Henderson's scream echoing across the port. The next morning, I joined the platform leadership in the control room. Maps were spread across tables, communication equipment hummed, and the atmosphere was one of focused urgency. "We've established contact with Platform Delta 4, reported the communications officer. Similar situation, no contact with shore. 32 personnel on board. Their water purification system is having issues." Jackson turned to me. "You're our mainland expert now, Blackburn. We need your insight on some decisions." I nodded, accepting the role. For the next several hours, we worked on establishing a complete picture of our situation. Resources, personnel, capabilities, and weaknesses. The platforms were well equipped for short-term isolation, but not for indefinite survival without supply runs. By midday, we made contact with 4 more platforms in the Salis Sea network. Each had similar stories: lost contact with shore, crew concerns about family, uncertain future. Between all 6 platforms, we had just over 200 people. A small community of survivors with specialized skills. Delta 4's water system was the most pressing concern. Without repairs, they'd be in trouble within a week. Echo 7 had the necessary parts, but transferring them would require a vessel journey through waters we couldn't be sure were safe. "I'll go," I volunteered. "I made it from shore once. I can make it to Delta 4. Jackson shook his head. "You're still injured, and you're too valuable as an information source. We'll send Martinez and Cho. They both have vessel experience. That evening, we watched from the deck as a small maintenance vessel departed for platform Delta 4, carrying water system parts and additional supplies. The radio crackled with position updates every 15 minutes. 3 hours later, they reported successful arrival and transfer. Our first victory. Over the next few days, a routine developed. I worked closely with Jackson and the platform leadership, helping to adapt offshore protocols to our new reality. My experience with emergency response proved invaluable in creating systems for this unprecedented situation. We organized the platforms into a network, each specializing in different aspects of survival. Echo 7, with its larger size and better facilities, became our central hub. Delta 4 focused on water purification. Bravo 9, with its expanded medical facilities, became our healthcare center. A week after my arrival, we sent our first scout boat back to the mainland, not to Bellingham, but to a small island in the San Juans. The team returned with grim news. The infection had reached even those isolated communities. But they'd also brought something unexpected: survivors. A family of 4 who'd been living in an old lighthouse keeper's residence. They'd seen our vessel approaching and signaled with a mirror. The children, ages 6 and 9, were the first we'd seen since the outbreak. Their arrival changed something on the platform. Seeing those children running through the corridors brought a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. We weren't just enduring, we were preserving something worth saving. By the end of the second week, we'd established a sustainable system across the platform network. Solar panels supplemented our fuel generators. Fishing operations provided fresh food to complement our stores. Regular communication schedules kept all platforms informed. We began broadcasting on emergency frequencies, hoping to reach other survivors. That's how we found the Coast Guard vessel that had been at sea when the outbreak hit. They'd been circling, afraid to return to shore, running low on fuel and supplies. We guided them to Echo 7, adding 23 trained personnel to our community. The Coast Guard crew brought wider news. The outbreak wasn't just regional. Their last communication suggested it was nationwide, possibly global. Major cities had fallen first. Military containment had failed. Government continuity protocols had been activated, then gone silent. With each passing day, our offshore network grew stronger. We developed systems for water conservation, power management, and food rationing that could sustain us indefinitely if necessary. The platforms became more than just survival outposts. They became communities. But we couldn't stay isolated forever. We needed to understand what we were facing, to know if there was anything left of the world we'd known. So 1 month after my arrival on Echo 7, we organized our first major reconnaissance mission to the mainland. I insisted on joining despite Jackson's objections. My ankle had healed, and I knew Bellingham's layout better than anyone else on the platform. Plus, I had first-hand experience with the infected that could prove valuable. We selected a team of 6, myself, 2 Coast Guard personnel, a platform engineer, a medic, and the platform's security officer. Our mission was to assess the situation in Bellingham, search for survivors, and recover critical supplies, particularly medications that were running low across our network. We departed at dawn in one of the larger maintenance vessels, armed with makeshift weapons and wearing improvised protective gear. The mood was tense but determined. For most of the team, this would be their first encounter with the infected. For me, it was a return to the nightmare. The Bellingham waterfront came into view after 2 hours. The city looked abandoned, with no signs of human activity visible from the water. Multiple buildings had burned to the ground. Others stood damaged but intact. Nature was already beginning to reclaim some areas, with overgrowth visible even after just a month. We docked at a small private marina north of the main port, hoping to avoid larger concentrations of infected. Our plan was to move inland in stages, reaching a medical clinic about a mile from the shore, then a pharmacy in the downtown area if conditions allowed. Stepping back onto the mainland felt surreal. The streets were littered with abandoned cars, some with doors still open. Personal belongings scattered by fleeing owners lay weathered by rain and sun, and the silence, the unnatural silence of a once bustling city, pressed in from all sides. We moved in formation, keeping visual contact and maintaining noise discipline. The Coast Guard personnel led, followed by the security officer and myself, with the medic and engineer in the protected center position. The infected were still present, but seemed to have spread out from the dense concentrations I'd witnessed during my escape. They'd wandered individually or in small groups, moving without purpose until something attracted their attention. Our first direct encounter came 3 blocks from the marina. An infected in business attire stumbled out from an alleyway, drawn by some small noise we'd made. The security officer took it down with a silenced rifle shot before it could alert others. The clinic was our first target. It had been looted, but not comprehensively. The Coast Guard medic found antibiotics, analgesics, and other essential medications still secured in a damaged dispensary cabinet. We filled our backpacks with as much as we could carry. Throughout the mission, I kept looking for signs of other survivors. Fresh barricades, recently extinguished fires, anything that might indicate human presence. But there was nothing. Bellingham appeared completely abandoned to the dead. As we approached downtown for our secondary objective, the pharmacy, the infected became more numerous. They congregated in open areas like parks and parking lots, drawn perhaps by some lingering memory of social behavior. We were forced to detour multiple times, adding precious minutes to our exposure. The plan called for us to be back at the vessel before nightfall. Every delay increased the risk. The pharmacy had been thoroughly looted, as we'd feared. The front was completely destroyed, shelves emptied of anything useful. But our engineer pointed out something the earlier looters had missed: a locked storeroom in the back. Breaking in would create noise, potentially drawing infected. We set up a defensive perimeter while the engineer worked on the lock. I kept watch from a second-story window, tracking infected movements in the surrounding streets. That's when I saw them. Not infected, but people. Actual living people moving tactically between buildings about 3 blocks away. A group of perhaps 7 or 8 individuals, armed and organized, clearing a path toward what used to be a grocery store. I alerted the team immediately. After a brief discussion, we decided to make contact. Survivors working together meant possible allies, information, and resources. But we needed to be cautious. In this new world, other humans could be as dangerous as the infected. We secured our pharmacy supplies and moved toward the grocery store, maintaining cover and stealth. As we got closer, I could see the group more clearly. They wore mismatched body armor and carried a variety of weapons. They moved with military-like precision, covering each other as they advanced. When we were about a block away, one of them spotted us. Weapons were immediately raised on both sides, a tense standoff ensuing in the middle of the abandoned street. "Identify yourselves," called their apparent leader, a tall woman with a shotgun. Our Coast Guard officer stepped forward slightly. "Coast Guard and offshore personnel. We're on a supply run. Non-hostile." There was a moment of consideration before the woman lowered her weapon slightly. "You came from the platforms." I stepped up beside our Coast Guard representative. "Yes, Platform Echo 7. We have a network of survivors offshore." The revelation seemed to impact them. They exchanged glances, and their weapons lowered further. "We've been trying to reach the coast for weeks," the woman said. "Radio's been picking up transmissions, but couldn't pinpoint the source." They called themselves the Cascadia Collective, a survivor group formed from military personnel, police, and civilians who'd managed to escape the initial outbreak. They've been operating from a fortified community college campus about 5 miles inland, gathering supplies and searching for other survivors. Their leader, Major Sarah Winters, former Army Reserve, invited us to their base to talk further. It was a risk deviating from our mission parameters, but the potential value of contacting an organized survivor group outweighed the danger. We radioed the vessel, informing them of our discovery and new plan. They would maintain position but prepare for immediate departure if necessary. The journey to the community college was tense. We moved through infected heavy areas, sometimes forced to engage when stealth failed. I watched the collective members dispatch the infected with practiced efficiency. They'd been doing this for weeks, developing techniques that worked. The campus came into view after an hour of careful movement. They transformed it into a fortress. Chain-link fencing, reinforced with vehicles and debris, formed a perimeter. Lookouts were positioned at strategic points. Inside, I could see gardens already established in what had been decorative lawns. We were escorted to the main administration building, which served as their headquarters. Along the way, I saw perhaps 60 to 70 survivors going about various tasks. Some tended gardens, others repaired equipment or stood watch. Children, actual children, played in a secured courtyard under watchful eyes. Major Winters led us to a conference room where maps covered the walls. Bellingham, the surrounding counties, the coastline, all marked with notations about infected concentrations, supply locations, and hazard areas. "We've been mapping everything," she explained, "trying to understand patterns, find safe routes to the coast. We knew there had to be others out there." We shared information freely. I told them about our platform network, our resources, capabilities, and limitations. They told us about conditions inland, other potential survivor groups they'd heard rumors of, and the general state of the region. The picture that emerged was bleak but not hopeless. The infection had devastated population centers, but isolated communities had survived. Communication was the biggest challenge. Without functioning cell networks or internet, coordination between survivor groups was nearly impossible. Major Winters proposed an alliance. The Cascadia Collective had skilled personnel and inland access but limited resources. Our platform network had resources and security, but needed mainland connections for long-term sustainability. Together, we could be stronger. We stayed overnight at the campus, much longer than our original mission parameters allowed. But the opportunity was too valuable to rush. On morning, we'd established the framework for cooperation. Regular supply runs, information exchange, eventual relocation of some survivors to the platforms and vice versa to share skills. When we finally returned to the vessel with our medical supplies and the news of our alliance, the relief on the faces of our waiting crew was palpable. We not only accomplished our mission, but found something precious. Hope that humanity was rebuilding. Back on platform Echo 7, Jackson and the Leadership Council received our report with cautious optimism. The contact with the Cascadia Collective represented the first step towards something beyond mere survival. Over the next several weeks, we expanded our operations based on the alliance. Regular supply runs became routine. We exchanged personnel. Medical staff from the platforms helped with treatable conditions at the campus, while their security experts helped train our people in dealing with the infected. Information from the collective helped us reach other survivor groups along the coast. Small fishing communities that had isolated themselves when the outbreak hit. A research station in the mountains that had sealed itself off. A group living in houseboats who'd avoided infection by staying on the water. With each connection, our network grew stronger. The platforms became central hubs, offshore havens where people could recover, train, and prepare before returning to reclaim parts of the mainland. 3 months after the outbreak, our community had grown to over 400 people spread across the platforms and secured mainland locations. We'd established regular communication protocols, trade routes, and defense systems. We were no longer just surviving, we were beginning to rebuild. I found myself in a leadership position I'd never expected. My background in safety protocols and emergency response made me valuable in planning operations and training new arrivals. The skills that had once seemed mundane, reviewing evacuation procedures and conducting safety drills, now helped keep hundreds alive. But the infected remained a constant threat. They didn't diminish over time as we'd hoped. If anything, they seemed to be adapting in subtle ways. Some appeared to remember locations where they'd encountered the living, returning to those areas repeatedly. Others seemed to travel in loose groups more consistently than before. We lost people despite our precautions. A supply team ambushed by a previously undocumented horde. A fishing boat that didn't return. A section of fencing at the campus that failed during a storm, allowing infected to breach before it could be repaired. Each loss hit hard. In our fragile community, every person was essential, every skill valuable. We couldn't afford to become complacent or take unnecessary risks. That reality was driven home 6 months after the outbreak, when we detected an unusual pattern of infected movement near Bellingham. They appeared to be concentrating along the coastal areas, drawn by something we couldn't identify. I led a reconnaissance team to investigate. What we found was disturbing. The infected were following sound, as they always did, but this wasn't random noise. Someone was deliberately attracting them, using speakers playing recorded sounds to direct their movement. We tracked the source to an abandoned naval facility north of the city. Approaching cautiously, we discovered another survivor group, but nothing like the collective. These people had militarized, using the infected as weapons by herding them toward rival groups' territories. They called themselves the Regulators, and they viewed all other survivors as competition for limited resources. They've been aware of our platform network for some time and saw us as a threat to their control of the region. We withdrew without making contact, but the damage was done. They'd spotted us during our observation. 2 days later, they attacked one of our supply vessels returning from the mainland. We lost 3 people in a boat full of critical medical supplies. The conflict escalated quickly. The Regulators began systematic attacks on our mainland operations, using both conventional weapons and directed infected. The Cascadia Collective came under siege, forced to abandon outlying positions and concentrate their people at the campus. Our Leadership Council convened an emergency meeting. Some advocated for cutting ties with the mainland entirely, focusing solely on platform survival. Others pushed for a military response against the regulators. In the middle of this debate, we received an unexpected radio transmission. Another survivor group, based in Vancouver to the north, had been monitoring the situation. They'd offered alliance and support against the regulators, whom they'd been fighting for months. The Vancouver group had military resources we lacked: actual combat vehicles, heavy weapons, and trained personnel. With their help, we might be able to neutralize the regulator threat and secure the coastal region for all survivors. But accepting their help meant committing fully to mainland reclamation, a dangerous escalation from our careful, limited operations. It meant potentially losing more people in direct conflict. It meant becoming something other than the peaceful community we tried to build. The debate lasted 3 days. In the end, necessity won out. We couldn't abandon our mainland allies, and we couldn't allow the regulators to continue using the infected as weapons. We accepted the Vancouver group's offer. What followed was the largest organized operation since the outbreak. A combined force of platform personnel, Cascadia Collective members, and Vancouver military units converged on the regulators' naval base headquarters. I was assigned as a safety and evacuation coordinator, ensuring we had fallback positions and extraction plans if things went wrong. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially doing my old job, just under unimaginably different circumstances. The operation was planned for dawn, when the infected were typically less active. 3 groups would approach from different directions, neutralizing regulator outposts, before converging on the main facility. The operation began at first light. I was stationed at our forward command post, a fortified fishing lodge 2 miles from the regulator's base. From there, I coordinated with our 3 strike teams as they moved into position. The plan was precise: time to minimize both our casualties and civilian losses among the regulators' forced labor. But combat operations rarely go according to plan. Team 2 encountered a hidden outpost not marked on our intelligence maps. The resulting firefight alerted the main base before the other teams were in position. The regulators responded by activating their infected herding systems, massive speakers broadcasting sounds designed to draw the dead toward our positions. Within minutes, hundreds of infected were shambling toward our teams from multiple directions. Our careful military operation suddenly became a desperate fight for survival against both human enemies and the infected masses. I received frantic communications from all 3 teams as they were forced to abandon their planned routes and seek alternative paths. Team 1, led by Major Winters, managed to push through to the base perimeter, but became pinned down between regulator defenses and approaching infected. This was the moment when all my training truly mattered. On oil rigs, we prepare for cascading failures, where one emergency compounds another. The principle was the same here, just with higher stakes. I directed our reserve units to create noise diversions, drawing infected away from Team 1's position. Meanwhile, Team 3 repositioned to provide covering fire. For 6 hours, the battle raged across the coastal area. The Vancouver military units proved their worth, using armored vehicles to break through regulator barricades. The Cascadia Collective's knowledge of local terrain allowed our forces to outflank defensive positions. By mid-afternoon, we'd pushed into the naval facility itself. The scene inside confirmed our worst fears about the regulators. They'd created a brutal hierarchy, with leadership living in luxury while captive survivors were forced to work in dangerous conditions, essentially used as bait and labor. The final confrontation came in the base command center. The regulator leadership, cornered and desperate, threatened to activate an emergency protocol that would draw every infected within miles to the facility. It was their ultimate insurance policy, ensuring that if they fell, everyone would fall with them. I was called in to assess the threat. My background in safety systems made me the most qualified to determine if they could actually execute their plan. What I found was terrifying. They'd rigged a coordinated system of industrial sirens and speakers throughout the surrounding area, capable of creating a noise event that would indeed draw infected from miles around. We had minutes to make a decision. The system was on a countdown, triggered by the regulator commander before we'd captured him. It couldn't be disabled in time. But as I examined the control mechanisms, I realized something. We couldn't stop it, but we could redirect it. The broadcasting system was directional. By reconfiguring the signal patterns, we could channel most of the infected away from our forces and toward the uninhabited coastline. It would require precise timing and coordination, but it was possible. I worked frantically with Vancouver's communications expert to modify the system. Our teams began a fighting withdrawal, pulling back to safe positions according to the new infected flow patterns we were creating. As the countdown reached 0, we activated our modified broadcast. The response was immediate and terrifying. From every direction, infected began moving toward the signal paths. Thousands of them, more than we'd ever seen in one place. They'd floated like a grotesque kite between buildings and through the trees, following the sound corridors we'd established. Our plan worked, mostly. The main infected horde moved away from our extraction routes, allowing our forces to withdraw with minimal casualties. But a secondary group, more than we'd anticipated, broke off toward one of our evacuation points. Team 2, already boarding boats at the small marina we designated as their extraction point, found themselves suddenly in the path of hundreds of infected. The radio call for help was calm but urgent. They needed immediate support, or they'd be overrun before they could launch. I was closest, having just finished at the command center. Along with 3 Vancouver soldiers and a collective member, I took a jeep and headed for the marina. We had to reach them before the infected did. The drive was a nightmare, navigating roads clogged with abandoned vehicles and scattered infected. Twice we nearly crashed avoiding groups of the dead that suddenly emerged from side streets. When we finally reached the marina access road, we found it completely blocked by wreckage. There was no time for hesitation. We continued on foot, moving as fast as we could while maintaining noise discipline. We could hear the infected ahead of us, a massive shuffling and unintelligible groans growing louder as we approached. The marina came into view, and with it, a scene of impending disaster. Team 2 had loaded most of their personnel onto 2 fishing boats, but the dock was beginning to swarm with infected. A small rear guard fought desperately to keep them back, while the final group boarded. We opened fire from our elevated position, giving the rear guard the breathing room they needed to complete the evacuation. As the last boat pulled away, we found ourselves isolated, cut off from our own extraction route by the infected who now turned their attention to us. The Vancouver soldiers spotted a small shed at the edge of the marina parking lot. We made a break for it, narrowly reaching the structure before the infected closed in. Inside, we barricaded the door and windows, creating a temporary refuge. But it was just that temporary. The infected surrounded the shed, pounding relentlessly on the walls and door. The thin wood wouldn't hold them for long. We needed another way out. I noticed a maintenance hatch in the ceiling, likely leading to a small attic space. It offered our only chance. One by one, we climbed through, pulling the hatch closed behind us just as the infected broke through the door below. The attic was cramped and stifling, but it kept us alive as the infected filled the space beneath us. Through cracks in the roof, we could see that the operation had largely succeeded. Regulator resistance had collapsed. Our forces were completing their withdrawal, but we were trapped, with no way to signal our position without drawing more infected to us. We spent a tense night in that attic, taking turns watching and resting. By morning, the infected concentration around the marina had thinned slightly as they gradually lost interest in the area. Through careful observation, we identified a potential escape route across adjoining rooftops. The journey back to our lines was arduous. We moved only when necessary, used noise disciplines practiced in hundreds of drills, and took the long way around infected concentrations. It took us nearly 2 days to reach the forward operating base we'd established at the fishing lodge. The joy on our comrades' faces when we walked in was something I'll never forget. We'd been listed as missing, presumed lost. Our return felt symbolic of the operation as a whole, difficult, costly, but ultimately successful. The defeat of the regulators marked a turning point in our post-outbreak world. With the coastal region secured, we could establish permanent mainland operations without the threat of human antagonists using the infected against us. More importantly, we liberated dozens of survivors held captive by the regulators, bringing them into our growing community. In the weeks that followed, we formalized our alliance with the Vancouver group. Together with the Cascadia Collective and our platform network, we created what came to be known as the Pacific Alliance, the largest organized survivor community on the West Coast. 1 year after the outbreak, our alliance comprised nearly 1,000 people across multiple locations. The platforms remained our secure hubs, but we'd established permanent mainland settlements as well, including a coastal town we'd completely secured and fortified. We'd learned to live alongside the threat of the infected, to respect their danger without being paralyzed by fear. Regular patrols kept them from concentrating too heavily in any one area. Noise disciplines became second nature. Every settlement had evacuation protocols and safe zones. Life began to take on new rhythms. We farmed, fished, and conducted salvage operations. We trained, built, and planned. Children attended school again, learning both traditional subjects and essential survival skills. Medical facilities treated injuries and illness. Some couples even got married, choosing to build families amid the ruins of the old world. I found my place in this new society as head of what we called the Safety Division, a group responsible for developing and implementing protocols for all alliance operations. My experience on the oil platforms proved invaluable in creating systems that balanced necessary risks with proper precautions. We still conducted regular reconnaissance missions deeper inland, searching for other survivor groups and gathering intelligence about infected behavior. On one such mission, 6 months after the regulator conflict, we made a discovery that changed everything. A research facility in the Cascade Mountains had survived intact, its staff continuing their work throughout the outbreak. They've been studying the infection, working to understand its nature, and possibly develop treatment. When we established contact, they shared their findings. The infection wasn't permanent. It had a life cycle. In infected individuals who hadn't died, the neural symptoms eventually peaked, then gradually diminished. The process took roughly 18 months. After that period, cognitive function began to return. Not completely, not to normal human levels, but enough that the infected were no longer mindlessly aggressive. They became docile, confused, but capable of basic comprehension and even rudimentary communication. This discovery sent shockwaves through our community. The infected we'd been fighting, avoiding, and fearing might not remain threats forever. Those who had been turned early in the outbreak were already beginning to transition into this post-aggressive phase. We had to adapt our strategies accordingly. Some advocated for containment rather than elimination, arguing that these post-aggressive infected might eventually recover further. Others remained skeptical, unwilling to risk lives on unproven research. We settled on a middle path: containment zones where the earliest infected could be observed safely, while maintaining our established security protocols everywhere else. It was a controversial decision, but one that aligned with our commitment to rebuilding rather than just surviving. 2 years after I fled the burning ruins of Bellingham, I stood on the deck of Platform Echo 7, looking toward the mainland. The coastline had changed. Nature had reclaimed some areas, while our settlements stood out as islands of order amid the chaos. Lights glowed from our fortified communities as evening fell. Behind me, the platform hummed with activity. Children played in the common areas while adults finished their day's work. Hydroponics gardens produced fresh vegetables year-round. Rainwater collection systems and desalination provided clean water. Solar panels supplemented our power generation. We created something remarkable from the ashes of civilization. Not just survival, but a genuine community. People working together, building something new rather than just clinging to what remained of the old. I thought often of those first 48 hours after the outbreak, of the desperate flight from my office to the maintenance shed, of Chen's sacrifice and my harrowing journey to the platform. Every safety protocol I'd ever written, every evacuation drill I'd ever run, every emergency response I'd ever planned had prepared me for those crucial hours. That's why I'm recording this message for distribution throughout our alliance, so that others can learn from my experience, so that the knowledge I gained in those first critical hours won't be lost. If you're watching this, you've survived somehow. You're not alone. We're broadcasting this message on a rotation from Platform Echo 7, emergency frequency 15.320. We have food, medicine, safety. We can help. Before all this, I spent my career preparing for disasters that most people thought would never happen. Now I know there's no such thing as being too prepared. Stay quiet, stay smart, stay alive. And if you can reach us, we'll keep the lights on for you. This is Hadel Blackburn, Safety Division, Pacific Alliance, signing off from Platform Echo 7. Good luck out there.